Ato Único, Luz, prepara 8-3. Foi!
This is Synopsis, a series of conversations with composers on the subject of compositional practice. Today, the guest is Caio Csizmar. Caio, welcome. Caio.
Thank you.
Welcome, yeah, and please introduce yourself.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Caio Csizmar. I'm a Brazilian composer. I am 23 years old. I'm making contemporary music for the past 7 years, but I've been into composition since I was very young, and I became an autodidact, a self-learned composer. But then I got into university and stuff, and I have been writing for groups and stuff for the past 7 years. That's it.
So, how did you do this autodidactic studies? If I may ask, what was the beginning of your composition studies?
Sorry?
You were saying you were basically autodidact, learning by yourself. How did that look like?
Yeah, that was very challenging because here in Brazil we have a very fragmentary um, formation. So we are not actually in a conservatoire, or we don't do a continuous formation. So we actually learn from people we live with, or with other musicians, or you know we we have to. It's the natural Brazilian way to learn things in a very fragmentary way. So it was very interesting because a lot of different influences came to my music. I started with playing the guitar, as most Brazilians do, and I played the rock. I played rock music and jazz, and I was very into jazz and progressive rock and stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff permeates my music, and it's not strictly European or strictly Brazilian or strictly anything. It's a lot of things permeate the music, So the autodidact part of it was very interesting because I could analytically look at a lot of things that are not generally analytically looked at, like rock or jazz in the contemporary music sense. So it's very interesting.
So, did you play in a band as well?
Yeah, I did play in a few bands, but I started on the guitar, on the acoustic guitar, and then I went to electric guitar. But then I moved to the bass, the electric bass and upright bass, and stayed playing the upright bass with bands and professionally for a few years. And then I went mostly to jazz. So I played in jazz trios and quartets and stuff.
Hmm. And in this, starting with the bands, did you also compose for them?
Yeah, this is very interesting because, uh, well, I've since I was very young, I used to create melodies, and when I started playing the guitar, I didn't really want to learn things note by note, and I wanted to create things. I wanted to improvise. That's why I went into jazz, because I felt the freedom to create and to improvise. And when I went into jazz and I had bands, I started composing, and this is how I got into chamber music, because I felt a little bit frustrated because as I loved progressive rock and jazz and jazz fusion from the 70s, and it's very challenging music, and I wanted to do that sort of thing because I wanted to play that sort of thing, but the musicians I was playing with didn't have the patience to learn this kind of stuff and to do this kind of stuff. So that's when I discovered Bela Bartok and Schoenberg and the composers from early 20th century, because they were doing things which influenced progressive rock and jazz, and people were playing it. So that's why I went into chamber music to write anything I wanted to write and find people who were actually willing and able to play it. So this is how I got into chamber composition through my um, through my experience with jazz and with people not playing the compositions.
So, if I understand correct, in the search for musicians that would perform fusion with you, you found
Mhm.
uh, classical or just chamber and modernist music and composers. And so,
Yeah, that's right.
did you ever realize the fusion visions?
Yeah, it's funny because it's actually one of my it's one of my missions still today, because my music is very involved with rhythm. It's the main thing in my music. It's the search for new rhythmic possibilities, and I found that with jazz and with fusion and with progressive rock, this was the common element between them, which attracted me. And I didn't know that before. I discovered that little by little. And so the rhythmic field is is my main field of composition, because of course, um, composers, we have different parameters as the main parameters. Some people listen to beautiful chords and feel like, oh, this is this is great. This is what I listen music for. This is what I make music for. And the melodic aspect and the rhythmic aspect is my main passion. They are my main passion in composition, and this is why I now I see that this is why I loved fusion and I loved jazz and I loved progressive rock for the rhythmic aspect. So this is what I'm still trying to. I always try, but it's sort of complicated because as musicians are not really trained that much to play that kind of stuff, and this dissonance happens because contemporary musicians, they are very used to very rhythmic complex stuff like Fernhow and Elliott Carter, but sometimes when you get a little bit too into the syncopation stuff and the rhythmic aspect in itself as a proposer to the music, as a proportion to your musical discourse, it starts getting a little bit frustrating for some musicians in the chamber music. Some things that are very natural for popular musicians, like doing something like, which is a very Brazilian thing. So if you don't play on the one, you play on you're not playing on the one, you're playing between the beats. So small things like that sometimes are very, very frustrating for chamber musicians, even Brazilian chamber musicians, which are trained in a very European sense. So this is why the fusion aspect, which you asked, is still a bit. I'm still trying to get it across with notation itself and with composition itself, because always have to talk about it and explain to the musicians. And yeah, so which is
Have
very
you
funny.
ever considered mm, running an ensemble and basically preparing your composition through fusion practice,
Yeah.
like regular on
Sorry.
a regular basis?
Yeah, this is a very interesting idea because a while ago, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I made some albums by myself at the pandemics, and I was playing the instruments, but all I have was guitar and bass and drums and stuff like that. Instruments which are linked to the popular performances, and I recorded that, but using my compositional methods of composing for chamber musicians and for composing contemporary music. But at the same time, that closely resembles what a lot of prog artists were doing. So because of the guitar and etc. So it's still hard to dissociate these popular instruments from their original context. A lot of people were linking it to Frank Zappa and stuff like that,
Is
which was
this
also a
is
very
this
interesting
something
composer.
that's published on your website or
I
not?
had I published it for a while. I had it published for a while, but the
It's
main
not
issue
there
was
anymore.
that it's not there anymore because the distribution company that was distributing it had I had a little bit of an issue with that because it was spamming the albums a little bit, and everything that I was making out because they were exceptions. I generally composed for chamber formations and ensembles in general, but that was a little bit of an exception, and it became a little bit through spamming. It became a little bit of my main thing. So everything I was making after that became a little bit obscured or undermined because of that in the uh, research mechanism like Google and stuff. So it's not on the it was on Spotify, but it's not anymore. Uh, but it was a very interesting experience because I made it, and then I found people to play it, people who are very willing to play these songs, and it was a very interesting experience. But it was yes, the part of rehearsing and uh, trying to get a studio that was, it was I feel like I wasn't ready for that part, the logistics part of that, because I can understand what you go through, because it was, even if the band we had like 5 people, and then it was something like, oh, can you rehearse on Friday, and 3 were like, oh, I can, and 2 were like, oh no, I cannot. It was incredibly hard just to get a full rehearsal. So I cannot even imagine doing a festival and doing a compositional program which involves a lot of people. The scheduling thing is really, really, really hard. And it starts becoming non-musical in a sense that I was just wanting to make music, and but the non-musical aspect of it becomes really, 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 really decisive. Really, really,
Mhm.
it's imposing a lot of things which are not musical. So I feel like I wasn't ready for that before, but now I'm thinking more about these aspects now for the past 3 years since I stopped doing that.
So, and how do you see the like next step? You said this. You actually take this as your mission to realize. We were addressing fusion at a, I guess, really high level. If I understood you correct, how do you see the next steps? What do you see you can do here as a composer, and what perhaps are not, as you were already addressing, that musical um, tasks to do here.
I feel like one of my utopias, if I may say, is sort of a pedagogical one, in a sense that I believe a lot of things are already there in the repertoire. We have many rhythm composers like Ligeti, and as I said, Fernahal, um, Bartok himself. But I feel like a lot of things are already there. But as we are not educated to listen to many things, we are actually not receiving many models if we don't look for them. So when I say models, is I mean the elements which are the proportion of the music, which the music the cosmos of the music is are based on, and these show what the cosmos of the music is. um, and I feel like many pieces that are actually very, very intricate in rhythm, and are not a caricature. They really have to. You really have to listen for it. You don't have to, because as we are very harmonically trained, the theory of harmony is very extensive for the past 200, 300 years. So it's very extensive, and we are listening to this kind of stuff. We're listening to intervals, and we're listening to chords, and we're listening to chord progressions. And when we talk about harmony, we're not talking just about the formation of chords, but we're actually talking about functions and stuff. And we're talking about systematic approaches to composition through interval construction. And I feel like rhythm is something put into the intuitive category. So if your music is very harmonically well constructed, and rhythm is secondary, or it plays a support role, sorry, it's fine. But when harmony gets secondary and rhythm plays a main role, and things start get a little bit more, for many listeners and for many teachers and stuff, it's almost a deficit. It's as if it's okay, but what about the harmony? What about that aspect? So I feel like um, I've been talking about it with my fellow composers, and it's I believe that we composers have the I mean, we can do things to reduce the listening. So I could say, oh, to bring the rhythmic aspect to the front, I could really exterminate all the parameters, and I could really make my music about that. But at the same time, I feel like I prefer the multiplicity of construction of the musical discourse. So I prefer when many things have different directionalities and many things are being built simultaneously, and I don't feel like taking them off just to say, oh, look, I will show you that it's just rhythm. So it's only rhythm, and you will only listen to the rhythm. uh, I don't feel like that's my approach. I also believe that if something can be heard, but it's not the thing which is being heard the most by the most people, it can be taught or induced or directed through talking about that music and just writing and just searching and researching. So my to answer your question in a very long way, but it's my main goal now is to do as much research and publish as much as I can in the field of research and analysis and talking about it, and publish articles and stuff about rhythmic construction, about rhythmic functions, which has functions. Because when you go to university, a lot of stuff we have harmony classes, and we analyze things harmonically. And in terms of rhythm, here in Brazil, at least, we have rhythmics, which is we learn to play rhythms. But I don't feel like that's teaching much about the rhythmic parameter as a functional uh, tool. Is as most as you're saying, oh, you can learn harmony by singing in the choir only, and I don't feel like you can learn the rhythmic aspect only playing the drums or only playing things. It can help, it can facilitate things, but I feel like the theoric foundation of it is still lacking a lot. So that's my goal.
So to systematically, let's say, build or go through ways or aspects of practice and studies and research that could, in the end, facilitate a skill set of a musician so they would be able to perform, let's say, one of your future compositions that is demanding in this area, if I understand correct.
Yeah, I feel like that, and again, that's always utopic because there's only much we can change. Then you know, but I feel like this type of thing becoming a little bit more conscious and a little bit less intuitive in a theoretical sense. Um, it can help people with cognitive tools to understand more about the rhythmic aspect of things. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of pieces and a lot of music that has a very strong rhythmic force, but it's not seen as much as a rhythmic thing, but it's more like, for instance, one of my favorite pieces ever which is the Opus 7 by Arnold Schoenberg, which is his string quartet number one. It wasn't the first, but it's named string quartet number one, and it's fantastic in terms of the rhythmic construction, the phraseology, the polyphonic textures. It's totally fantastic. But as it is Schoenberg, it's mainly seen as a harmonic construction, and people analyze the harmony and stuff. So I feel like there's a lot of things to be uncovered, which are already there, but it's a cognitive thing. So I feel like this type of thing could help both listeners and musicians and composers actually.
Well, have you ever considered also in this course addressing uh, the different perceptions of rhythm? Because from what I noticed, and I've also heard other composers speak about, was that um, the musicians trained in the classical canon, and for example, jazz musicians have already the perception of rhythm and of time in music very, very different.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
are you actively taking a look into that, or do you have it somewhere in that plan? Because perhaps one of the keys could hide there.
Yeah, very interesting take. I feel like this is very necessary. There's a composer who he was born in Brazil, but when he was very young, he moved to Europe with his father. His name is Malcolm Bruff, and he's a very very good composer. He's a pianist and he plays mostly jazz, but his music deals with something he calls micro rhythm, which is these type of rhythms that are not they're impossible to notate, and they come from traditional music from everywhere around the world. So he talks about samba, for instance. It's not taka 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 taka. It's tik 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 tik. So some notes are short and some notes are longer than others, and the musicians play it seamlessly. They play it, and we are born here in Brazil. It's totally natural for us, but it's very hard to
For me, it
notate
would
this.
be very difficult, for example, right?
Yeah,
To
and
say.
it's yeah, and I believe it has totally to do with what you just said, because we have different time perceptions, even in where we are born. So I believe, for instance, it would be even easier for a classical musician here in Brazil to play samba than for a European classical musician to play samba. And this gradation. I feel like what you said is very important to take into consideration. And he says that, for instance, some African musicians, um, they feel rhythm in waves, so they're not thinking like us on steady beats or binary subdivisions. They're thinking of things in waves, and it's very interesting. It's a very interesting work in that field, and he talks about that. So yeah, I feel like this is very very necessary. But the thing is, his writings, yeah, are very concerned with that, in the sense of how we get it through, how we get these things, how do we notate these things, how we
Yeah.
explain these things. Because
Mhm.
how do you explain something like that? How you have to feel it like that, but the sheet music is not telling you. Even jazz, when we write swing on the score, like what is exactly swing, how much swing. So yeah, it's interesting. And the idea his idea is that he to get these micro rhythms, composers can use that synthetically. So you can, for instance, if you if you get a triplet, for instance, and you get a rhythm which is a quarter note and two eighth notes, and then in ta 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 and ta 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 ta, and when you try to move from one to the other, gradually, but you stop in the middle of the process. So that's how you can get micro rhythms from stopping between two different types of notation. And this is incredibly hard to do in terms of notation itself, because how do you notate something that is in between a triplet and a binary rhythm, and at the same time you say no, you stop at 75% of that process of gradually transforming from one to the other, and then you have to find ways. So I'll use a quintuplet, but it's not, it doesn't convey the exact bodily movement you need to have in order to do
Yeah.
that. Because because again, in samba, for instance, when you do the tuk, 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 it's a body thing. You're feeling that in that way, so you're dancing that in that way. So yeah, it's really really hard to do that, but I believe it's central to the question of rhythm to take that into consideration.
Yeah, and it's curious to observe this. I found. Um sort of I discovered this on the example of a melody of a pitch. Well, just practicing Mozart, I started realizing that all the music is microtonal when you take a close look at it.
Yeah.
Um, and then, in what way microtonal will, in the end, define perhaps what is called a genre or,
Mhm.
let's say, period, or at least as we think and theorize about it today.
Yeah.
That might be, incorrect, or as we are taught in schools, because if everything is flat, especially as if you're a woodwind player, okay, there's pianos and accordions and um, but woodwinds, strings. It's not about the sound being on the exact pitch all the time. It's moving a lot. Well,
Exactly.
and once you try to stabilize it, you realize how demanding that is. Um, but first of all, that actually, yeah, it's most of music is microtonal. Uh, from that aspect, simply not being right there because
Hmm.
you're adapting to the harmony on top of which you are. And then also, when we're discussing rhythm, um, I wanted to say I would take the perception thing even further. I would say that in the end, even the nature of the instrument will, um, uh, how to say that, will actually guide some of the perception of a performer. Um,
Totally.
because
Mhm.
uh, my, let's say this is like a hypothesis, but um, a part of what I'll say is probably to ascribe to perhaps the skilledness of an ensemble or of an orchestra, but let's say in the high school orchestra, of course,
Mhm.
it's not the highest skill orchestra because it's students in the formation, but still there, and even in professional orchestras, I've observed that sometimes it's like the strings were at a different place than the
Yeah.
rest of the orchestra. So
Yeah.
what's happening there? It's and I'm claiming that that's a perception of rhythm partial
Yeah. Of course.
due
Yeah.
to
Sure.
the mechanical production of sound, which is so much different on the string. And also, then, if the conductor is a string player,
Mhm.
maybe the strings will be closer to his conducting than the rest of the orchestra,
Yeah.
you know?
This is very interesting because even what you're saying is something that composers can instrumentalize that and can use that as a tool. So, for instance, if you want to write something like Stockhausen would, or even Elliot Carter himself, or Charles Ives, if you want to have like different poses or different rhythmic constructions for different instruments, or I can think about a lot of things like, so taking into consideration, this rhythmic aspects of the strings. How could I give a different tempo for each section of the orchestra, or an ensemble, which was very difficult to do, but how I could make a piece which feels natural to their rhythmic uh, naturalities, like the rhythmic habitat would
Mm-hmm.
be
Mm-hmm.
something that is consciously expressed in that piece. And it's something it's very difficult because then we get into the not only the idiomatic writing of for instruments, because when you think of idiomatic aspects, we most composers don't take into consideration that type of thing which you're talking about. Sorry. And it's something that I have been doing as well in terms of what types of notes I've been using. For instance, ornaments, or achacaturas and stuff like that. how we can use that sort of thing to make things feel a little bit more unpremeditated. So things feel a little bit more natural, more as if they're improvising the true nature. And it's really it's something really hard to do as well, because at what point something starts becoming too hard to reproduce and it feels unnatural, but at the same time the composer is trying to achieve a natural effect. So how do we balance that? For instance, if I want to write something that feels so natural that I need to use a lot of tuplets, or as many tuplets as possible, just to if you look for any jazz transcription which uses tuplets, it's incredibly complex. So if I just want to do something like a written rubato, for instance, but I need to use quintuplets and septuplets and stuff like that. So it's I'm still trying to find a way to manage the performance of these things, of these natural things,
Yeah.
which is very natural to the instrument if they're playing, but if you notate, suddenly it becomes too cerebral,
That's
right?
the
So
exact example of what it means to perceive rhythm completely differently. Because
yeah,
when you try to transcribe a jazz solo or see a transcription that is made by, let's say, standards of a Western classical canon, it
yeah,
becomes superiorly complex.
yeah,
While there's just quarter notes and eighth notes in the original sheet,
exactly.
probably.
Yeah, exactly. And it's crazy because the musician is playing it very naturally, as you said. So
Yeah.
Bill Evans, which is like his piano playing a lot, it's incredibly complex. Ahmad Jamal, another pianist. It's incredibly complex, but it's so natural for you who play piano to do that sort of stuff. Even when you're playing Chopin or this sort of stuff, I was one of these days I was rewatching the Mark Argerich uh, Ravel's Piano Concerto in G major, and it's crazy because you have this the hands are not moving at the same rate most of the times. Like the notation is very binary, but it sometimes they have some sort of flam, so it's like not like tron, like tron, ding, ding. So
Two different
it's natural for
rubatos
you.
happening at the same time
Yeah,
as well.
and this is very natural for you, right? This is what you learn. This is how you bring the melody to the front most of the times. And it's different rubato. And if you're gonna notate that in a very very specific way, it becomes extremely complex if you're
I mean,
writing, right?
it becomes really complex. That's why I ask, do you consider in your path making the ensemble that perhaps focuses, specializes in this? Because the way I see this in my own compositional practice, or
Mm,
and everything around it, specifically how to realize the compositions. Uh,
mhm.
Here it comes to for me to a question: wouldn't it be better to simply build your own ensemble and practice with them? So in the end, you can only use. I'm gonna put this a little bit as a caricature, only quarter notes, but
Mhm.
actually everything will happen that needs to
Mhm.
happen in the domain of rhythm or melody, but it won't be achieved through super complex notation, but rather through um, rehearsal, I don't know, through actual hearing of that, through actual building of a skill set specifically for that.
You just gave me my 2025 project. So this is this will be
But I wanted to ask you
this will be my
also.
yeah. This is I really I love this idea. It's incredible.
I mean, for me, it's anyway a mission to yeah to start maintaining a group of musicians that would be able to dedicate a lot of time to performance of my compositions. just to do that. And up to some extent, I've already had that in a different country than where I live now. And it made a big difference because although it gave me some excuse to, then notation can become very non-readable for anyone else but the people that have seen it before, have worked with it before. So then it becomes a challenge to write a new piece for
Yeah.
someone that didn't play it yet. But I wanted to ask, you were mentioning writing different tempos for different instruments, trying to adapt to their natures, if I just correct me.
Yeah.
Is a insolitez dos dias depois para piccolo, violão e violoncello. Is that kind of a composition?
Yeah, totally. That's
Yeah.
yeah, it's totally because the idea for that piece was to write for the three instruments in a way that would feel very natural to them, and they would have conflicting materials in terms of tempo, and then they gradually move to phase. So they start very differently, and they gradually go to it's sort of a as if you're getting two pieces of translucid material, and then you gradually do this. So the idea was that, and it was very hard to do that with the musicians because it took sometimes the first rehearsal uh, um, was was really hard to get these things. But when we got things uh, more natural in the sense of the listening to, oh, this is what is supposed to happen, it became very natural. And what you mentioned becomes extremely important to that, because I feel like this type of writing can sometimes get into the musician's nerves, and the composer becomes very when people are having nightmares about you, it's not good. So
But at
yeah,
the same time, it cannot become too much of a factor.
yeah, and it's incredibly hard.
Evil composers speaking.
Yeah, exactly. It's, oh my god, it's yeah, and you start yeah. So and again, I really ask myself, how much is this not also the composer's um, uh, what's the word? Yeah, but this is the composer's responsibility as well, because
Composers'
um,
responsibilities. Let's talk. Let's
that's a
speak
hard
about it.
topic, isn't it? Yeah, but I feel like how much can we dissociate ourselves from the actual performing context, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I'm always asking myself, because there's this thing of, oh no, don't make concessions, and don't write whatever you want. This kind of serialist thinking, which is very predominant here in Brazil, which is you write the music you want, and if I write the music I want, I will write that sort of stuff, like a different tempo stuff, and it's really a few the 2022, what I did was 2021 actually, when we were in the pandemics. The idea was, if I want, I wanted to get rhythmic configurations, which you cannot know the time signatures and stuff, but you can still hear the rhythmic configuration. So the idea was, as we were in the pandemics anyway, and people are playing at home and recording at home, why don't I needed to have a duo to, why don't, instead of writing for them to synthetically synchronize to a click track and pretend they're playing together, why don't I write two different pieces and I put it at the same time, which is something you know John Cage did, and it was a very crazy experiment, and I call that the poly pieces, which is the term itself. It's sort of it's debatable, but thinking about polyrhythms and polypulses, and what's the next step of that. But and then it became a tool. So there's a piece of mine called Entre Mundos, which I work with that. I work with pushing and pulling with it's a poly piece, and I have two different pieces, but they sort of interact with each other sometimes and don't interact, and became a tool just like polyrhythms. So how can I bring that sort of stuff? And again, it was very hard, but for a duo, there were other difficulties because people who play chamber music, they are always training to play together and do things together. And how do you ignore the other person and play your piece, and the other person is playing their piece? But sometimes you need to uh, synchronize. So but it was something that worked very well in the sense that I could achieve things that if I were to write that using templates and stuff would be very complex. But the psychology of performance becomes a little bit more manageable when you're not having to think, oh, I need to play on the third note of a quintuplet and here and but since then, for Insolites, for instance, I tried to write that way with a written rubato and using templates and stuff to get it was as an experiment, and they manage it, but as I said, it was very very hard. And this is what as I mentioned, Frank Zappa was doing, right? The ensembles, with the ensembles, like having the ensemble, because you need a lot of practice. So you need much practice to get this stuff right. And the reality of the young composer is that most pieces, you're going to write them, and you're going to spend some months writing them. And especially if they are hard, they're not going to be played anymore really soon. So
Yeah.
you get a performance which is
One
not,
time you
yeah,
get one chance, just like Eminem.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I imagine you're also been through that because I feel like every composer goes through that, and sometimes even pieces which you like a lot are not going to be played anymore and going to be played
Mhm.
one time. And what's the use of having a piece which will be played one time, but the musicians don't want to play it, and they're having nightmares about you, and they don't, and you're not going to be able to use the recording, and the audience is not going to like very much because it isn't performed the way it's supposed to be performed. And it's a lot of questions about it. I just also wanted to ask you, I know it's hard to talk about it, but what's the do's and don'ts of uh, coordinating an ensemble like that, like having people play your music?
Well, I guess
Maybe logistically
you're
speaking.
well. We were you mentioned composers disassociation from the performance.
Mhm.
As I ran this ensemble for it was Abeceda ensemble also at that time. Um, that was 220 to 221. Um, it was I was very always very engaged.
Mm.
Um, Partly because I tend to compose in a way that demands me running a rehearsal
Mm.
as well.
Mhm.
Um, and I cannot say whether that's a model where that actually this is a model where I can speak from. When you
Mhm.
ask me about that, you should know that.
Mhm.
Um, but the principle I followed was to demonstrate a lot, and
Okay.
it's curious you ask uh, as why the mentioned composition that I heard, the Insolites, uh, draw my attention especially was because I noticed a similar phenomenon happening as I tend to facilitate through composition, which is
Mm.
different rhythms tempi at the same
Mhm.
time. And further on, you were addressing ensembles being probably also I was trained like that. Uh, throughout my whole music formation, which I had since 8 years old, in Slovenia we have a very kind school system, public music school system, where you can really enter at a young age into public music school system. And we're trained from then to always be together. And that's the repertoire, that was the repertoire demand. And in what I saw in this in Solites was, and now I realize as you were speaking of it, the same thing I achieve, but much less controlled. You do it, you write it in. I usually facilitate it through different protocols or mechanisms, different mechanisms, but the same thing, just with much less control. And as I put it recently, just overwhelming the performers slightly and playing on this card basically that we were trained to do this. So then when you are demanded that you do that, there's this somehow, I don't know, a friction happening, resulting in not controlled performance. And it's somehow that was intended in many of the compositions I wrote. And when achieving this through a rehearsal, through leading an ensemble, it was always on a very short time frame. So the way I went for that, and that presented most of the repertoire that ensemble performed as under my leadership. It was very 2 hours, 3 hours preparation, and it was very much leading it in a sense of just preparing everyone there to let go and just try to achieve that best point of where you control, but you don't control anymore. So, and very intuitively, whatever I saw was necessary to achieve that point, that was some sort of a principle for me. That's at that point.
To get to that point where you control it, but there an element of not controlling it. Right? And it's interesting because this is an element which I like a lot about the fusion, jazz fusion music, which is how some things can be controlled and not controlled, in the sense that not only in the sense of improvisation, but in the sense of how musicians are behaving in terms of the psychology of performance. Because, for instance, using a contemporary music equivalent, for instance, I love Ligetis Piano Concerto, and it's one of my favorite pieces. And some performances are really, 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 really good, but they're really polished and they're really crystalline. And I feel like I'm more drawn to some performances which are more, the musicians sound as if they're challenged. It sounds challenging. They are playing. They're not sounding as if they're struggling, but they are sounding as if they're challenged. So they have control, but at the same time, there's a bit of it's not totally controlled, and it sounds challenging, like and the rhythmic aspect also in that sort of environment. I feel like it comes to the front, the rhythmic richness of the instruments and stuff, because everyone is playing not exactly, but a little bit before and a little bit after, and this sort of micro rhythms, as you mentioned about microtonal music, but the sort of micro rhythmic stuff happens in that in that place, for me at least. I feel like
The unwritten, uncomposed micro-rhythmic stuff, or the actual composition micro-rhythmic?
Yeah, I feel like when the group is on that sort of on the verge, they're very challenged. I feel like even if it's not written, but it naturally comes out when they're playing, like when they're it sounds challenging, and it's for me when it's is in that place, it's a very good, not totally, because some if it goes to one extreme, it sounds struggling. If it goes to other extreme, sounds
Yeah,
too
yeah,
comfortable.
yeah. But we, but you sort of cannot achieve it with full control because we're so
Yeah.
trained to not go there.
Hmm.
Because it's like a magnet, the however you want to call it, static pulse or just pulse or one pulse, or it's
Hmm.
like a magnet that draws. So I see that as in like a serious inhibition here, that
Hmm.
you can in one way or another then compose through, and work with perhaps in the end.
Yeah, and it, and it's I feel like there's also in terms of notation, as you were mentioning, the notation aspect of that, it's it's really hard because sometimes I feel like, for instance, for myself, the thing is, oh, I'm notating what I feel like this should be, and I know sometimes there are going to be mistakes, and not mistakes in the sense that they're playing it wrong, but they're playing it and keeping the general vibe, the general manière of the piece. But
Mhm.
how much of that isn't also my responsibility if I'm trying to frustrate the musician? Because you're gonna train a lot, you're gonna be out into hours and hours of training, and then the composer, oh, but you don't have to play that exactly. But so why did you write it exactly then? And this is what I'm always asking myself. So uh, for instance, Ligeti himself, when he wrote the Requiem, I was uh, I was reading an interview one of these days, and he would say, "Oh, if you are making mistakes, it's what I set out to achieve with this kind of notation, because it becomes part of the texture. But there's also the part of the frustration of the musician. He's got to be hours and hours training that. Oh, I need to play that quintuplet right and the notes right, and then after 10 hours of training, he comes to the rehearsal, and the composer, you don't need to play that perfectly. So yeah, it's a, in terms of human interactions and the psychology of performances, I'm still trying to find
I,
a,
I guess
a
this is
halfway
the
point.
place where you get all of these variants of a
Mm-hmm.
composer precision demands. Uh, because I guess if you could set two profiles, the idealist and the pragmatic
Mm-hmm.
composer, and all everything in between, and then the performer, I think out of habit, perhaps less and less, but expecting that it's the idealist and there it needs to be 100% as it's written. And composers sometimes themselves, ourselves, not knowing where in the spectrum to aim,
Mm-hmm.
um, how much is to compromise, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then there being all of the different ones where it's actually intended, or perhaps sometimes not said, but I, in my experience also as a performer, I see that there's also many times that it's good that performer thinks and actually prepares as if it needs to be exact, and works toward that, and then wherever they get to, it's all right, because in the end,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps it's because we're aware that there was a very limited time to prepare it, or
Mm-hmm.
simply that it goes way over, uh, or maybe it was a long time to prepare it, but it would take 3 times as long or something. So
Mm-hmm.
you get all this, but no one actually speaks about it as straightforward as we are right now, I
Mm-hmm.
think.
Yeah.
At least, actually, I cannot say no one, but I haven't heard it myself.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's curious.
Yeah. It's the thing you said about the where in the spectrum we focus, I feel like for instance, here in Brazil, most composers fall into the idealist spectrum, and I feel like I'm really really on the extreme of the idealist side of that, because when I'm thinking about the rhythmic functions and the idea of phraseology, sometimes in my compositional process I think, okay, this needs to be work that way because this is gonna oh, sorry for that. But yeah, what this is going to do in the perception of the temporal flow of the music is very specific, and I feel like this is very you can hear that in a lot of performances if you listen to string quartets, which tend to vary a lot in terms of tempo between one recording and another. I feel like sometimes the composer writes something which is rhythmically intended to be uh, a densification of something, or it's oscillating between things, and sometimes the performance doesn't do that, and does a rallentando, and it doesn't achieve the rhythmic effect which was intended. So sometimes something which is supposed to be taka 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 ting, and sometimes string quartets taka 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 taka, and they do a rhythm thing, and the function of that changed, the phraseology of that changed. So I feel like, since I'm very concerned with that in my own practice of how exactly things should function in in the syntax of the music, in the grammatic of the music, how this should function, I'm always thinking of being really, really, really precise in the rhythm notation. But the issue with that is that if I'm not getting that in the performance, what's the actual use of that? So if I intend to write like a septuplet or seven, which is like, tack, 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 and but I only hear the tack tack tack. I don't hear the tack 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 tack. I don't hear the ghost notes. I only hear the accents of tack tack tack. But then, what's the difference? I mean, if I'm gonna write that tack 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 and get a tack 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 in the performance, wouldn't it be better if I wrote tack tack tack? Because if I want to get tack 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 tack, if I'm writing like a binary subdivision, if what's the difference between these two things? You know, so if I'm gonna write I say, oh no, I'm not gonna write a binary subdivision because the musician is not gonna play it right, and what I want is a subtuplet. But at what point it becomes too specifically cerebral and not the intention of the function that I intended, because music is something physical, right? We are listening to it. The score is of course important, but so what kind of trade should I do to get what I want? And I feel like this ties to what you were saying, like getting an ensemble, and you write only quarter notes, for instance. But I'm gonna write these two 8 notes, and then or and I'm gonna write that, but you played it that way. You drag a little bit on the second note, or you make the first one longer, and
I
yeah, that
mean,
type of thing.
just a remark in jazz, as I observe it, and I'm not an expert, of course. However, in jazz, it seems to me that it's very, very clear where to phrase how. Perhaps
Yeah, totally.
today, when blah blah blah, but I think, and it's not arbitrary. So if you played, I guess I'll build another high flying hypothesis. If you played in Miles Davis quartet,
Hmm.
I think none of this was arbitrary. So it was not like this time it's like this, that it's you just
Yeah.
have to hear it and then play it, and it's repeatedly. Even though
Totally.
it was not like, oh, now this quarter note is of course perhaps somewhere, I don't know. I'm speculating, but I think just to address that, because I think that's what you then can achieve in the ensemble, not some arbitrary, like we stretch it here, it becomes reproducible, I think.
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
that ensemble.
totally. What you said about jazz, I feel like the phraseology of certain groups of jazz is very is very specific. It has a very specific color, a very specific flavor, and they
Yeah,
repeat that, and you can oh, it's that group because they're doing that sort of thing repeatedly in the rhythmic sense, and
yeah,
even in the ornamentation sense. Because I feel like something which is very important in jazz, and is very important to me, are the how to there's we don't even have a term for that in music theory, but the because it's not necessarily sometimes the ornamentation. For instance, you see the written standard, and it's something like it's something like tan 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 tan, tan, and then sometimes the musician like "Tralan, tralan, tan, tralan, titan, tan." So this kind of ornamentation with achacaturas and pojaturas and sort of stuff, which is something that is also very common here in popular music in Brazil, when you don't actually hitting the notes on on the head of the beat. It's you preparing the sort of so it's not this sort of stuff, and it's very important. And there are some pieces of mine which have been performed,
mhm,
which some musicians even took out the ornaments. They're like, oh, we need to get so we need to get the rhythms right, but we need to also get the pitches right. And if we cannot get it right, this sort of stuff gets like dynamics and ornamentations and sort of stuff. Sometimes in articulations also uh, get to the after we do the more important things, we do those, and if we cannot do those, they get out. So it's and for me this is crazy because for my music I prefer if someone is not getting the pitches right, but the contour right, but they are using that sort of ornamentation because this is part of the rhythmic construction of a piece. So yeah, and also a lot of times I think of pitches, for instance. It's not that I don't think of harmony because when you're dealing with harmony in a supportive way, and not in a central way, many people think, oh, so you're not thinking of harmony, you doing anything. But a lot of times I think of intervals, recurring intervals, as a density oscillation tool. So, for instance, if I'm always using a major seventh in the middle of a very expressive rhythm or melody, I'm thinking of that not necessarily for the color of the pitch of the interval, but of the density oscillation that creates in the contour. And
mhm,
I'm reusing that sort of thing as I said, as a temporal density oscillation thing. So and this it seems complex, but when we think of percussion, for instance, this is very easy. For instance, if you have three wood blocks, unpitched wood blocks, but they have like a relative pitch, and you have tones. So if you're listening to you're listening to there's a density oscillation in the contour, but you're not listening. Oh, this is a C, this is a D, this is an E flat. So this sort of thing, and it's of course difficult to manage that in terms of how much I incorporate that in my music, in terms of the usual listening experience the the, the audience has. Because if the audiences are educated in a harmonic listening, how much of that uh, are they not hearing as harmony? So if I write some notes intended for oscillation, but they're listening that for harmony, and something is always going to be lacking on that because the listening of that type of construction is as it is possible, but it's not the main one from the audience, which I've noticed. So that's why I always feel like it's also a pedagogic thing to talk about this kind of music and to draw attention to this kind of stuff in a way that makes sense.
and so therefore we can expect to read um, in the future to read many texts from you made
I
in
hope so.
whichever form on this theme.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Where do
hope
you
so.
intend? Do you already see where you will publish this? Where this will be accessible?
Well, this semester we actually, even today, later I'm gonna talk to Pedro Pasquale, which is he's also participating on the fest. We're
Yeah, we had an interview
friends.
just recently. Mhm.
Yeah, and we're friends, and we are planning on writing an article together. We don't even know because we think very differently about music, but there are things which are very important to us. The sort of organic forms and the temporal aspects of music, in the broader manner. So we're planning on writing on that this semester and see if we can send for a journal for publication. But this is something we're arranging. And also, I have my website, www.caiocsizmar.com, which I'm intended to create a section for this kind of thing, for publications and scores. So very soon there will be a section on my website for that.
Wonderful, because it will be linked next to this publication. And since
Oh,
we are now
thank
approaching the end of the conversation, I wanted to simply just to go through the standard conclusory questions for you. Hence, a short message for um, anyone that will, after this, go and listen to your works, and a short message for other young, not young, young in a different sense, aspiring
you.
or just to be composers.
Hmm. Nice. Yeah, I feel like one thing that is very important for composers, programs like this are very important. The Abeceda program it is very very important because we feel respected. We feel it's as if our compositional efforts and what we have to talk about is taken a lot into consideration. And this is not very common, at least for instance here in Brazil and other festivals I participated at. It's not very common, and I feel like we should aim always more uh, for that. Having programs like this, we young composers especially, I feel like we need to think more about festivals and programs and things and having ensembles, because we're always thinking of, oh, I want to write my music and I want to get my music played, and this sort of stuff is very very important to have these mediums, right? And to have this kind of thing, where we can also meet people. I've met a lot of great composers, not only through the YouTube channel, but also our first meeting um, with Alistair. So
The precept
really really
concept
nice.
percept workshop, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is amazing. I've met a lot of great composers and great music, and I'm feeling very 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 grateful and very lucky as well to be part of that.
Wonderful. And thank you for sharing. And for the future listeners of your music,
Well, for future listeners of my music, I hope.
simply, yeah, anything, anyone that goes and listen to your music, if there's anything to say there.
Well, I hope these considerations which I've mentioned about the rhythmic construction and the rhythmic functions and the kind of phraseology can be taken into consideration in the listening. But I also feel like this could point to other things. I'm not an island. I my work talks with a lot of other stuff, as I mentioned, jazz and progressive rock, and Ligeti and Schoenberg and other, many composers. So I hope my work can express in itself what enchants me in other music. So I hope I can, through my music, show you what I love about music, which is, these aspects which I've talked about. So I hope that can, that can be a way of listening to this music, and also, have misreadings as well, because if and other readings, you can listen to my music through other lenses and other prisms, and I hope it can be a lot of different things as well, not only what I intend, because I feel like, as I said, I don't like to reduce things, but I like to, um, there's an intention, but I hope this intention can speak with a lot of different types of listenings.
Wonderful. Caio Csizmar, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.